anything in our environment, any technology, unfortunately, can be used for bad purposes as well as good purposes. What really determines the outcomes is how humans choose how to use it.
Do you feel like the world is moving too fast and the people in charge are too slow to respond? Have you started to wonder whether our institutions, government, tech companies, even education, are actually capable of keeping up with what's coming? And maybe you've asked yourself, what would it look like to lead differently? If you felt any of that, this episode is for you. Today on Sense Making Conversations, I'm joined by David Bray, a globally recognized strategist and technologist who's worked on everything from cyber ops and bioterrorism to disinformation and future governance. He's led 2 bipartisan U.S. commissions, advised Fortune 500 companies, and has been named one of Business Insider's 24 Americans changing the world. David brings a bold, human-centered lens to navigating complexity. In this conversation, we explore how the future of governance isn't about institutions. Rather, it's about imagination, and how AI and digital acceleration are challenging what it means to lead, why trust is migrating from global to local, and how we can reclaim our agency through shared responsibility and more human-centered design. And I'll be back at the end with the key takeaways that I took from this conversation. So stay with us all the way through. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this is Sense Making Conversations. David, welcome.
Great to be here with you, Andrea. And I have to say, you set that bar so high, I will hopefully meet and possibly exceed expectations.
Well, David, I've known you for a while, and I always so enjoy our conversations. So I was excited to get together today and just riff. But I know you, and I've just given a little bit of a background. But the thing that I notice about your career and the work that you've done is you've gone from cyber ops to governance to many other things. What's the common thread that pulls all that together?
Good question. I would say, they say that life always makes more sense in hindsight. And if I look at the last 20, 25 years, I would say that I am always questing to better understand. So it's in those periods of crisis, it's in those periods of change that you really come sort of face to face with, one, what does it mean to be a human, both individually and collectively? And then two, what are the things that we want to hold on to? What are the principles we want to hold dear? And what are the ones that we need to sort of figure out new ways of adapting because the world might require it? And so if there's any common theme between doing stuff in space with Ballistic Missile Defense Organization to bioterrorism to time in Afghanistan to cyber to experiencing disinformation and tackling disinformation, it's those moments when you come face to face with what does it really mean to be human and what do we want to hold on to and what do we want to adapt with?
I love that. And, what does it mean to be human? And that's a big question in today's world. It's one of the things that so many of us are tackling. And then what do we want to hold on to? What do we want to let go of? And, these are things that I know personally I tackle with a lot because in the work that I do, I work with so many different experts and change makers and people who are doing such incredible work in the world. And when I'm working with individuals like that, those questions become the very basis of what we work on. And I know for you, the work that you're doing is really at that very core level of societal anxiety, societal change. Like you said, what do we hold on to? What do we let go of? For you, when you think about the work you've done throughout your career, where did you see that beginning? Where did that anxiety, that social change really start bubbling up to the point where it became a conversation? And why was it important for you to actually do something about that?
So if I had to trace my origin story, I think it was my mom was a school teacher, public school teacher, and my father was a Methodist minister. My mom was not the traditional minister's wife. She was very outgoing, very social. She always liked to make people smile. Actually, that was her gift. She made people smile. She made people laugh. The bishop once came to visit my father. This was when large fake nails were in fashion. She was lighting a candle and her thumb caught on fire. And she turned to the bishop with her thumb on fire and said, "Want a light?" And my dad said we saw his short career pass before his eyes. But, the bishop laughed. And that was my mom. And my dad, his skill sets were inheriting congregations that might be fragmented for some reason or fractured, and finding ways to use narrative to bring them together, do some capital planning exercise that required them all to work together and achieve something, get something done, and then he'd move on to the next church. And so I was living that growing up, and I saw the art of, how do you motivate people? Quite frankly, church politics are actually worse than national politics, but conversation for another day. And so, I was sort of born into this environment in which change happens. What you often have to do is, how do you win hearts and minds to be motivated enough to be part of the change, so that change is something we do together versus something that we get thrust upon us. And for me, it was growing up as a child of the 90s. If you remember, there was a lot of conversations about ozone layer deterioration. And so I, on a whim, I wanted to figure out, could I go to the library? Could I get enough of the literature at the time? And I remember getting these actual research papers and understanding what was happening, both in terms of the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that we were releasing, and their impact on ozone, and ended up on a 286 PC just writing some code to see if I can model that, which caught the attention of the science fairs, which then caught the attention of the US government that said, we'd like to offer you a job. And it was at a physics facility initially that was simulating electron beams and what would happen with different particle accelerations. And then they said, when I was 17, I got called down and to the principal's office, and they said, we'd like to offer you a job. It's going to be a ballistic missile defense organization. They didn't explicitly say those words, but that's what it turned out to be. It's going to be classified, involves satellites, computer simulations, and space. And so, of course, I said yes. And I guess the rest is history.
Well, and with that type of a career, the beginnings of it, my goodness, that's the end of some people's career. That was the beginning of yours. And I think incredible, the view that you've had of the adoption and changing of technology. You started off by talking about what makes us human. What does it mean to be a human? And we have this world filled with technology today, and it keeps getting faster. It keeps getting more complex. I know you're working at a very deep level with that technology. But what are you noticing that it's doing to us as humans, but also to the societies within which we live?
So I would say the biggest takeaway that I've seen is anything in our environment, any technology, unfortunately, can be used for bad purposes as well as good purposes. I mean, a glass or even a chair, if I break the glass or I break the chair, I can create something that's a deadly weapon. And we're not saying we shouldn't have chairs in the world or we shouldn't have glasses in the world, but, it's recognizing what really determines the outcomes is how humans choose how to use it. And then if you go from there, then it gets to the question of, do these tools, do these capabilities, do these technologies, do they give us agency? And do they actually give us better choices, more choices? Or do they take away that agency? Because I think the way you design a technology can take away agency. So while I do say technology can be used for good and bad, the design choices can constrain what people can do or increase the playing field. And so I look at the last 20 years, and good friends with Vint Cerf. He's actually, he's come and spent time with my young son, and Vint Cerf and others. What they do with the internet, it was incredibly powerful for the time, both in terms of the initial plan, which was resilience if there ever was a nuclear war, which heaven forbid, hopefully never happens. But then when it was made public, it was the idea that we'd all come together, that it'd be increased understanding, sharing of knowledge. That was the believed nirvana, so to speak. And now I think we're seeing that, well, guess what? It can be used for good, and it can be used for less than good. And aside from that, too, the design choices associated with the internet and how the web has been placed on top of it, and platforms, social media, but also the devices we use, the smartphones and the apps, these may have resulted in two things. One, constrained choices, or at least people feeling like they've got constrained choices. Even though we have all these different apps we can choose to download, a lot of them have to be focused on being successful at monetizing something, which gets to the second thing, which is oftentimes the thing that is being monetized is our data, our exhaust. And I am concerned that the meme that data was somehow the new oil was absolutely the wrong meme. One, oil, use it up, it's gone. Data, use it, it's actually still there. And actually, if you involve people associated with the data, they find errors, they fix it, they make it better, they make better quality data, and they make it more relevant. So I actually say data can be a form of human voice and choice and preferences. And so if I was to, and I am actually, I'm continuing to, if I was to try and tackle something over the next 3 to 5 years, even before we talk about AI, let's get data right in terms of how do you have stewardship? How do you have some sense of agency about what's being done with your data? Because if we don't get that right, anything else that follows is going to make people feel more constrained, more anxious, and actually ultimately angry as well.
Well, I think you bring up a good point around AI and data, right? I mean, what is AI? Nothing more than an overlay on top of data, right? These large language models that are being augmented and constructed daily, really. We do have the models themselves, but they're constantly being added to. And with the work that you're doing, you talked about the way that they're constructed. And I think that's a really important distinction. And it's something that I know when it comes to AI and these large language models is really important because the leaders in the race to own AI, if there is such a race. And I know that we hear this a lot, and I don't know that anyone will ever own AI per se, but the models themselves are being informed, right? They're being informed, and they're being informed in a couple of different ways. One, by those of us who use it and give information, but it's also being informed by the construction of the tool that sits on top of it. And so the construction of that tool is informed by the human who's constructing it. And therein lies a question, because the bee that I've had in my bonnet for a very long time is that the values of those leaders, when we look at the countries that are actually creating it, they have different, very, very different value sets. What's your thoughts on that? Is there a risk? What's happening there? I'll just leave that with you, let you talk about that.
I mean, you raised several great questions about what are companies deciding on, what countries are deciding on. I often tell people, and I've done some writings on this over the last 2 years, we may be repeating not exactly everything that happened in the 1890s, but a lot of the rhymes. And what do I mean by that? So leading up to the 1890s, there was massive technological progress at the time. In some respects, multiple technological revolutions like we're seeing now. That led to some people that got the technology really quickly and were actually ended up becoming very wealthy tycoons as a result, the rise of corporations, but also a lot of people that were feeling displaced, that they were used to doing things a certain way and the world was changing. And at the same time, if you look at what was happening, not just in the United States, but in other Western countries, legislatures were more polarized actually than they are now. There was also Pulitzer and Hearst before Pulitzer saw the light that were selling newspapers with sensationalistic headlines that might not actually match reality. U.S. may have gone to war with Spain over a disinformation event. Remember the Maine? And it was also fascinating because it was also parallel to this rise of Ouija boards and this fascination with communicating with the afterlife and somehow having a voice, which I sometimes think those that see, that they're, now apparently people are claiming they're finding, souls trapped in AI. And I'm like, that's interesting. You're allowed to believe what you want to believe, but it might actually just be mathematics. But anyway, so I think if we look at those times and we look at our now, I think it's interesting because history shows it usually takes us about 25 years, about a generation, to figure out the good, the bad, and the things we want to definitely avoid when it comes to technology. I think we've got those cycles compressed because of just the sheer rate of global adoption that this unplanned experiment of rolling out generative AI has unleashed. And two things have happened. One, countries are trying to figure it out just as we as individually are trying to figure this out. And unfortunately, it seems like they've been sold the idea that there must be one AI policy to rule them all. And I'm like, let's think about what happened when IT came out, and these things called advanced data processing or ADP, back in the 1970s. We didn't have one IT policy to rule them all. We looked to healthcare, we looked to banking, we looked to commerce, and there were specific policies that came into play. And I think that's probably what we need to do for AI is say, AI in a commerce setting is completely different than AI in a healthcare setting, which is completely different than AI in a warfare or defense setting. And so I think there's partly that, but then we also need to unpack that AI is not monolithic. There's different flavors of generative AI that have pros and cons, but there's also rule-based expert systems or computer vision, and then there's Bayesian active inference. And so I often ask people, like, one, what flavor of AI are you talking about in what context? But again, this is a lot being thrown at us in a very short period of time. I do think the point that you raise, different countries, and even within different countries, there are different value sets. And to expect that there would be one global standard, not going to happen. But even within a country, especially large countries, I think we need to figure out ways of actually going back to the local level, because that's actually how we got through the 1890s, is that we actually went back to the local level and then scaled up, as opposed to insisting on some broad national, let alone global standard for everything.
I think that's a really an interesting point. Even though we live in these countries, these nation states that we all in some way, align to because it's where we were born, it's where our cultures were, sort of originated or where they became originated. We're also part of a global economy. I mean, in reality, the network or the internet has no borders. There's no nation state when it comes to the internet. If you engage in cryptocurrency, there's again no nation state associated to it. So we're living in this global economy. We're associated to nation states. And yet, to your point, it's at a local level where we've got the most power. How do we navigate this complexity? I mean, it's not to say that there hasn't always been complexity in our world. Of course, there has been when it comes to countries and cultures and things like that. But we've got this added complexity of a global economy, which has never been more true than it is right now. And when we go back to technology, technology doesn't know borders either. What can we do when we look at the human first? When we look at, the level of social anxiety that's happening, the amount of change that's happening in a short time. What do we do? How do we manage it? And with your experience at a governmental level, what's happening?
So, two things I want to put out. The first is exactly, I liked how you said, how do we manage change? It's a good question. I was actually yesterday at a different event and we were discussing, again, the sheer rate of that there's multiple technology trends, AI being one, but there's bio, space, IoT, and quantum also happening. It is worth knowing that for a lot of Western society, we look at change as things we need to address, that we want to get back to stability. That these are problems that if we solve these problems, we can get back to stability. And that's partly a legacy of World War II. After we had World War I, we had World War II. People said, we don't want to have World War III. So we need to put in place institutions, governances to prevent World War III. And fortunately, so far, knock on wood, we've not had a nuclear World War III, and hopefully we never will. But that's a Western perspective. There are other cultural perspectives that say, you know what? Change is all around us and it will always happen. And so I think that's an interesting sort of lens to consider, because we are asking people to address and adapt to the idea that it's going to be a period of ongoing change. It's not like we're going to reach some period in which we look back and we say, yeah, 2025 was very turbulent, but 2026, it all got better. So yeah, I'm not sure that's going to happen. Yeah. So that then leads to a question, which is what are the things you need to put in place for people to feel less anxious in the midst of a period of transition? And I would say my own experience is, if we unpack what does it mean to have a sense of agency, even if the world is turbulent, even if things are chaotic around you, and having led teams in responding to bioterrorism events or 9/11 or even on the ground in Afghanistan when things are whizzing by our heads. Three things. As a leader, you need to figure out, how do you give a sense of purpose? And again, you don't tell them their purpose. If you tell someone their purpose, not as good as helping them create the space in which they can find it. And you can give guardrails and you can give a vision, but let them find it themselves. The second, how can they demonstrate or provide value? Because we all want to provide value, whether that's economic value or social value, or just a sense that we are worth something because we are producing worth. And then finally, we all want to protect those who we care about. We don't want harm to come to them. And it's a very human nature. And so that too, if people feel like they can't protect either their life, their livelihood, or those they care about, then they get really anxious, and that anxiousness turns to anger. So if we think about, amidst the fact that there's going to be ongoing change, can we create spaces and create opportunities for people to identify what is their new purpose? Because purposes are going to change. What is their new way of providing value, and what is their new way of, or at least renewed sense of feeling like they can protect that which they care about? I think we'll have a much more effective, and it's worth knowing, because I do go to the balcony and look down at this, it's going to be a lot harder for free societies because we aren't centrally planned and we're not autocratic. And I don't want to be centrally planned and I don't want to be autocratic, but it's going to be a lot harder for free societies to do this than more autocratic ones, precisely because we have things like freedoms, free will, free markets, and things like that. And so I think that's part of the interesting chaos at the moment when you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer. And again, if I'm in an autocratic society, I'm not going to say I don't trust the government, because that's usually death. But at the moment, Western societies are experiencing a reported bigger sort of gulf between trust in any institution than more autocratic ones. And I think that points to that leaders in free societies cannot reach for the old playbooks. They've got to figure out ways of saying, look, to people, there's going to be change, but we're going to help you have spaces in which you can find your purpose, your way of providing value for yourself, and you'll figure out what that means, and protecting that which you care about.
Well, in doing that, so I think what's interesting about what you said, it's the government's role in helping people self-identify their own purpose. And, what we're talking about there is governance, right? So, and leadership. There's two kind of pieces to it. And those are different things. Governance, oversight, what can we do? What can't we do? Leadership, how should I act? How should I show up? Who am I as a human? What decisions do I make? And so when we think about governance and leadership, these are two things right now that we have, I think, often conflated, and they're not the same. They are very, very different. And so when we look at deconstructing those two things and saying, let's put leadership aside for a second and let's look at governance, because we're living in a world, to your point, that is in constant change. There is in many different countries, this call to, we want to go back to the good old days, right? Which I don't know when the good old days were. I mean, who knows? And I don't think we really want to go back, because in reality, we can only go forward. So, from a governance standpoint, as we look at technology, which is pushing us forward, I think we can all agree, at a rapid pace, that is probably pushing us in ways as humans that we've never been pushed. We're having to adopt, even at a physical level, to this rate of change. What governance is needed in the world today that isn't in the world?
So I'll answer it in three very short vignettes. The first is 1399. The Gutenberg printing press has not been invented yet, but there was early investments by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was an early investor in it. And then when the Gutenberg printing press did come about, it's worth knowing that for a period of about 150 years or so, there was people lamenting that the printing press is introducing typos into the works. Martin Luther's like, I don't even recognize my treaties anymore. There's these typos. There's also concerns. I mean, look, it took 300 years for copyright law to come about. They were copying things and not giving any royalties to anybody. What does that sound like? It was very fascinating. And there were a lot of people lamenting that it was the end of the world as they knew it. And quite frankly, if we look at 1399 and we compare it to 1600, yeah, I'm not saying we go back to 1399. Wasn't that great for a lot of people? And it's also knowing that even though the Catholic Church was an early investor, had they known that less than 100 years later, Martin Luther would pen his 95 treaties and cause a great schism, which eroded some of their influence in Europe, maybe they wouldn't have invested. So that was a period of massive change in which the world did change. We got through the back end of it. And, I think most people would say 1600s versus 1399. I'd pick 1600. It still had problems too, but, it was still better. Now let's fast forward. You talked about how there's this nostalgia that a lot of people have this now. If we could just go back to the 1950s, I think it's worth trying to sort of walk a mile as to why would someone think that would be good? Because I agree with you. 1950s weren't as great as we somehow imagine, especially for a lot of folks. But it was a period in which the perception was that if you were lucky enough, you all had to do was go to high school or college, just go to school once when you were young, and then you'd get a job for life. Maybe you'd change jobs once or twice in the same career, but you wouldn't have to relearn an entirely new industry, and you wouldn't have gaps. And so if you look at what's happened now as a result of both technological changes, but also associated second and third order effects in the job market and globalization and the like, I can remember in 2009, I got asked, what is the future of work? I had, as one does, this was nonpartisan, and I was writing it under urgent deadline. I had 5 days to answer this, came back with a briefing that said, again, multiple technological revolutions will be happening by 2020, will continue on for at least a decade or more. And this will cause displacement, and that we will have people that will have to relearn completely new professions that is foreign to them. So we're going to all have to go back to school. But on top of that, we all might be working multiple jobs, that the idea of having a job might be quaint when we look back. And so I think that's what a lot of the anxiety, and that's why there's this nostalgia. It's like, dear government leaders, can you just go back to the time where we only had to go to school once and we had a job for life? And it's like, I don't know. And maybe we'll find solutions where you can have continuous ongoing education. And actually, I think we need to have incentive models for that, because that's, I think, the future. But that then leads to the current moment. And I actually define leadership as the willingness to step outside of expectations and the ability to manage friction, whereas I define governance as that which we choose to do together that we cannot do alone. And so you can imagine there's an interesting tension, because governance is usually that which we choose to do together. Well, the question is, have we all decided what we want to do together in this moment? Some want to go back to the 1950s. Some some existing injustices to be addressed and everything like that. So that's part of the tension. And then do the people that are asking for people to play a role in governance, do they really want leaders? Because I often say everybody says they want change until they get asked to change themselves. And then they're like, no, 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 that's not what I was expecting. And so a leader versus a manager will meet expectations, whether it's from our boss, our peers, the public. We even have expectations from our reports. If you don't meet those expectations, then you're in trouble too. A leader will figure out just the right amount of friction to, yes, I'll meet some of your expectations, but I'm also going to go a little bit further. I'm going to say there's a better place over here. And yes, we're going to have to go through the wilderness. It's going to take some time. It's going to be hard. You might have to get some things up, but I promise you it will get better. And they manage that friction because I guarantee you when they don't do what's expected of them, even if it's better for the whole, people will push back significantly. And oftentimes, as we say, leaders don't get to see the promised land.
Right, right. So, I mean, what you really helped us to see there is that, while we need governance, we also need leadership. Like I think we can all agree, we don't really want to go back to 1950. We really don't. But at the same time, I can understand how, as humans, what we want is something that's familiar. And there's so much in our world that's unfamiliar right now because everything is happening so incredibly fast. What is it that maybe our leaders can do then, even on a governance standpoint, to help us to feel maybe some comfort, but at the same time, help us manage change? Because I think these are the two things that we're dealing with right now, right? Managing change, as we said, change is not going to stop. It's going to actually get faster. It's going to get more. To your point about the future of work, we've got these converging technologies that are changing things. Jobs are changing. They're not going to be the same. We are going to have a displacement. How do we help them manage this change? And what do we need from our leaders right now? And what should we be asking for?
That's a lot of great questions. I would say, so, I look to Desmond Tutu because I think Desmond Tutu is inspiring in that, again, apartheid was awful. He could have been very angry about apartheid. And he could have been, like, I'm going to shun those people that did apartheid. And he chose to both not only forgive, but to actually have a real look at truth and reconciliation. And it was a unvarnished look. And it was very tenuous for a while. But, I would say the reason why we had a more peaceful transition in South Africa post-apartheid is a large part due to the fact that he actually was willing to do that. So I think in our now, where the good news is anybody can publish whatever they want online. The challenging news is anyone can publish what they want online, including bots, as I have personally experienced. It creates an opportunity as well as a challenge for, we're not going to find one single solution that everyone's going to say, that's exactly what I want.
Yeah,
But
of
what we
course.
can do is create a big enough tent that says, here's the vision that everybody has the ability to find purpose. Everyone has the ability to find a way to provide. Everyone has the ability to actually protect which they care about within these boundary conditions. And that can be the constitution of a country, that can be whatever the principles are. This can also apply to organizations too, separate from countries. And then I often find the best leaders ask questions. Now, that doesn't mean they actually don't eventually take action, but what they're really trying to do is a listening, learning tour. And what I find so challenging in our current moment, if I could say, and I say this as a nonpartisan who believes, again, a good nonpartisan is serving a document, in this case, the Constitution, as opposed to a specific party. We have one party that is really good at reminding people, there were certain things we want to hold on to, but they're not talking about what comes next, if anything like that. And there's actually there's at least a biological underpinning that shows that that we humans get two different rewards in our brain. We get some rewards for when something is familiar and that it's not navigating the unknown and the unexplored. And there's actually some of us that will feel more mental pain when we actually find something that hurts us that's new, or even if we will actually we'll also experience higher joys. And so it's worth knowing, and again, not getting into politics, but there's correlations between those people who would identify as a political conservative that actually feel higher highs, but also lower lows when things go wrong. Then there's another group of folks in political parties around the world who are pressing for, we've got to correct some wrongs, we got to expand, we got to go to a more perfect union, we got to be better. And that's good. But that's also introducing additional newness and new change on top of what's already a new change. And for those folks, again, you can imagine there was a time in our human history which, if we didn't go beyond what we were already doing, the famine was going to come, or the flood was going to come, or it would be the end of the tribe or the village that we were in. And so we humans have these two tensions between, yes, Sometimes we want to hold on to what we're doing, and other times we really need to actually go over that hill, because if we don't, the tribe's going to die. And so I think having that conversation in a way that's accessible, I realize I gave scientific answers, but different audiences, different conversations, and saying there's a place for both. And then with that said, what is our North Star? What do we really value? And I think, if anything, that's where I find that for most people, they care about these things. I mean, even when I go to a place like China, with its 1.3 billion people, it is centrally planned. It is an autocracy. It only has one party. But you can guess that, local Chinese still want to have a purpose, even if the purpose is given to them by the state. They still want to provide, and they still want to be protected. And if anything, that's partly why they choose the system they do, because their history is they've been around for 3,000, if not 4,000 years, and had at least 7 revolutions that lasted more than 100 years that sent their country backwards. Whereas we in the West have more this idea that revolution is usually glorious, and it gives rise to freedoms. So I think in the context of governance, and I really think it is about governance, because I think things that used to be done solely by government no longer can be. I would say that governance is about creating a big enough tent, listening and learning, and saying, let's figure out where we want to go together. And ideally, the congregation, the group, helps set where we're going together versus just the leader.
So with that as a backdrop, do you think it's time to start talking about global governance?
I'd start locally, only because, so it's interesting. Just yesterday, I was at a different event where I gave both a talk and we did a panel on what's called gray zone conflict. And I think this is actually something that's good for people to also put in context, because we just talked about the fact that there's massive technology changes. There are also, how best to put it, there are also actors, mainly state-based, but some are non-state-based, that are using these technology trends to their own self-interest. And what do I mean? Here in the West, we have several documented cases of hardware-based chip-level attacks where things that we thought could be trusted are actually quietly phoning home, or things like that. And the reality is, for most of the West, we have outsourced our chip production, which means we are vulnerable to that exploit. Second, we just talked a little bit about data and how data can be both a good thing, but can also be weaponized. There's signs, again, that this is being used particularly to target free societies to identify, how do I create wedge issues? I mean, I experienced this in 2017 when I was in a nonpartisan capacity. We were doing our job, but there were actors at foot that wanted to flood with less than authentic bot-submitted comments. And at the time, I pointed them out, and people said, where's your evidence? And I said, patterns of life. And just to give a little context, usually in the United States, whenever we have a 120-day public commenting period, less than 1% of the 100-day 20-day comments receive more than 10,000 comments in 120 days. We were seeing 6,000, 7,000 comments a minute at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. U.S. Eastern time.
Wow.
I don't think I needed much forensic evidence to say, no, not real. But unfortunately, because again, I couldn't block the comments. I had been told by general counsel that you had to receive everything, even if it was possibly fake. I couldn't do any identity checks or anything like that, and I had to just accept everything. So we drank from the fire hose, received more than 2.3 million comments, which is massive. And later, after 4 years, after I sort of said something's a little suspicious here, the New York Attorney General did conclude that of the 23 million comments we got, at least 18 million were bot manufactured, 9 million for one political faction, 9 million for the other political faction. So at least they were balanced. But, that was 2017. So actors, both domestic and foreign, are also using what we see, what we hear in the information ecosystem to also polarize. And then finally, if we look at what's happening with ransomware, with cybersecurity, and with online scams, there are some statistics that say if you add up all the money that's being made by state and non-state actors from ransomware and scams, it's the 10th largest economy in the world in terms of GDP. So while I love the idea of global governance, I would say, no, we're not ready yet, because we're experiencing this gray zone conflict at the same time. And we have to go back to the local level. And it's worth knowing, because I did get asked to give a talk to the UN on Charter Day, that even when the United Nations was formed, there were people who rightly said that the United Nations can only work if nations themselves are mature internally first. And so it's worth saying how many of our nations are mature internally first. And of course, that was the 1940s when the UN was set up. Let's look at our current era. It's no longer about nations being mature. How many of our corporations are mature enough? Because now if you add up the 10 largest corporations in the world in terms of market cap and you sum them up, there is evidence that in 2017, if you summed up these 10 companies, their combined market cap was larger than any one country's GDP except for the top four, which at the time was US, China, Germany, and Japan. There is now evidence, needs to be confirmed, that this year, 2025, marks the year that now those top 10 companies in the world in terms of market cap are larger than any country's GDP with the exception of the United States, which means they have now surpassed China. And so before we talk about what we do in global governance, I think we need to actually say, are nations mature? Are corporations mature? And what can we do at the local level to help people have a sense of at least some cohesiveness? And what does local mean anymore, given that it's this overlay between physical and digital?
That starts to go, well, what's the role of the nation and what's the role of the corporation? And who's deciding that? And where is the maturity? And I think we're seeing a degradation of maturity. So so what is that? At the local level, you can't manage that. Then where is the next level? Because it can't be a nation state that is no longer at a equalized power level to the corporation that it that that lives within it. So what do we do? How do we bridge that?
Sure. So a couple of things. So one, recognize that the trends we are experiencing because of these technologies, as you said, are global in nature. I mean, a packet on the internet, I've spent 20 plus years in policy discussions where they say, Europe's got its GDPR, and they say, if you're doing business with someone that you think is a European national, even if they're somewhere overseas, you got to treat them with GDPR. And I'm like,
Yeah.
ooh, that makes things really
But
complicated. And now California has laws that say if you think someone is a Californian, even if they're not in California, I'm like, okay, this gets really challenging. Where is a packet of internet? Is it where it's sent from, received by, in transit through? But also, having done bioterrorism preparedness and responding to public health emergencies, infectious diseases know no borders, and we kind of lived that in 2020, 2021, and so we are all on this pale blue dot. Two things is there are power asymmetries at the moment between individuals and corporations and countries, and I actually floated this idea more than 12 years ago, and I think we could actually still revisit it, which is we need to figure out a way that people can go to countries, but also go to corporations and say, what data do you have about me? And I can actually ask you to remove it. Now, you see some of these efforts to do it. And the challenge is, of course, there's data brokers and everything like that. But until we actually figure out a way to restore a sense of agency as to what's being done with your data, again, it all falls apart. We have the technology now for federated learning that data doesn't have to be shipped somewhere. That if we formed a data cooperative, we could have our data be locally, whether we all are artists, we're all musicians, we all are people that care about this following issue or whatever it is. And we could insist that instead of you hoovering it up, and we actually record, if anyone attempts to hoover it up, then we got a lawsuit. We'd use existing law. But we could actually say, if you want to do it, then the cooperative itself will have some elected representatives or some appointed representatives that will broker that. And the algorithm will come and train in situ. So where the data is. And in return, there's either financial remuneration or some sort of gain, because maybe we all care about Parkinson's research. And so we're willing to share our healthcare data de-identified, as long as we know it's still saying where we've got it, and your algorithm is only taking away the following insights, and we can see that in the log, then yeah, we can do that. So I think, again, that's where I almost feel like, just like how when the printing press came about, there was a rethink of how we organized. Admittedly, 200 years later, the Catholic Church was less powerful than it was. And then there was the Treaty of Westphalia, and these things called nation states arose. So I think there will be some push-pull. I would also say, if we look at human history, when any one group takes too much from what we consider to be the public commons, ultimately, we do not respond well to that one group doing that. Eleanor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize before she sadly passed away, pointed this out time and time again, which is, yes, there's a tragedy of the commons. The commons can get eroded, but there's also a tipping point where if the common gets eroded too much, yeah, we get our knives and pitchforks, and it doesn't usually end well. And so I'm trying to avoid that, because I don't believe in knives and pitchforks, but I am trying to explain to countries as well as to corporations, which is, yep, I understand. You got to have return on investment. You got to have shareholder value. But if that's all you focus on, you may find the very marketplaces that you are currently selling to no longer want you there or no longer exist because they've got an upset.
I think what you're saying is powerful, in that one is, are we going to witness the fall of the very large corporation in our lifetime? And I think there's good evidence to say we're going to see a shift and a change, Because like you said, I mean, corporations, what, are about 100 years old, 120 years old when we really go back. And we've, in our lifetimes, of course, we've come to see them as just always been there, but that's not true. They haven't always been there. So they are a fairly new thing in the evolution of our societies. But at the same time, they wield a lot of power. And that power, in a world where we're shifting greatly, where things are changing rapidly, and where this, again, I'll come back to that future of work, which we know there's displacement happening. The role of the corporation, I think, is actually going to have, like, I wonder. I mean, and we haven't even touched on it, and there's so many more places I could go, and I know we don't have time today. But one of the things that I wonder about is the role of the corporation, the role of governance, and universal basic income, because I do think that there is something in there, whether you believe in, UBI or not. I think we can all agree that with a displacement, there needs to be a solution. So what is the role of the corporation? What is the role of governance? And is UBI maybe that answer? And I'll give you that quickly to see, because I know that's a big question, but
Sure.
what's your thoughts on that?
Well, and maybe to sort of wrap this all to tie it back together again, we recognize that nation states emerged about 200 years after the printing press as a way to organize better people, both protecting which they cared about. So it was geographical borders, sovereignty within those geographical borders, and to a degree, but not explicitly, providing value. And that later, again, in the Western society where we separate our private sector from our public sector, and I celebrate that, corporations within the last 120 years came about as a way of producing value. But even then, they didn't really answer the purpose question. The purpose question, I would say, up until fairly recently, was either if you were a person of faith, it came from your faith community, or it came from patriotism or some other belief higher than self. And so I think those are all up for grabs at the moment. You could see corporations say, you know what, we'll also protect you. And then also, hopefully, does corporations give you purpose, and also a question. And so to sort of like look to history again, it doesn't repeat exactly, but to say it does rhyme. It's one of the things I find fascinating is when there was the collision between the Catholic Church and the state of England. And this happened when, after Henry VIII passed away, Queen Elizabeth I comes to power. And now, because Henry VIII, of course, if you remember, left the Catholic Church and set up the Anglican Church, now you have Jesuit priests that are going into England, which is kind of hostile territory because it's now Anglican, and they're having to hide. So if you go to Oxford, there's actually places where Jesuit priests had to hide. And at the same time, England's response, because they were worried that the Catholics might try to put Queen Mary on the throne and dethrone Elizabeth I. So this was challenging the nation state's ideal, set up the first, quite frankly, modern domestic intelligence apparatus with Wellingham. And so it's an interesting thing to explore where one entity that was used to having power, in this case, a religious community, collided with a nation state, which was fairly novel. We know what eventually happened, which was, England still exists, and yep, they still have MI5 and MI6, but anyway. And so I raise that because we will probably see similar tension points, not just between corporations and countries, but we may see the rise of new faith communities. I mean, we don't know. It'll be interesting because some people look to AI already as if they're their own personal savior or whatever it is. That might be dangerous, but who knows? I do think some of the decentralized push. I've actually seen decentralized approaches being very effective to responding to disasters nowadays because you have so many different actors, including good actors from corporations that want to help out to respond to a flood or to a hurricane or to a fire. You also have good actors from government, and you have also just concerned private citizens that want to help out. So again, I'm biased because I come from a Western society that values freedom. I think if we can go back to decentralized edge-based approaches, that allows almost everybody to have what they want, whether they want more stability and are willing to give up freedom versus they want more freedom, but they recognize that may also be more turbulent. And so I think we will get through it. In terms of UBI, that is, I think, a proxy for the deeper question, which is how do I provide value? And if we can, I do worry that that alone won't address the fact that we humans need to have a sense of providing value. In fact, there's signs that when a lot of people retire and they don't find a way to switch from doing vocational work to avocational work, their health declines, their family's health declines, their community health declines. And so we've got to get to the deeper thing, which is for whatever reason, thanks to evolution, we humans need to have a sense of not only purpose, but providing value. And if you take that away from us, we don't get to good places.
David, I think on that note, that's the perfect note to sort of end on, that we as humans need to have purpose in order to be able to feel as if we are giving something back. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with, and how can they stay in touch with you and follow your work?
Thank you for that, Andrea. I would say if I could leave anybody with is, even though it may feel like these are looming, abstract, big issues, what difference can I make? I would say just have a conversation with someone about the issues for about 10 or 15 minutes a week or a day, if you can do it, because then you at least are voicing what's in your head. It's no longer trapped inside you, but listen just as much as you have the conversation, and focus on what I would say, which is being bold, being brave, and being, most importantly, benevolent. As for finding me, I'm on LinkedIn. If possible, say you listen to this podcast, because I do get a lot of bot requests. And so say not a bot and listen to the podcast, but happy to connect with folks on LinkedIn. And again, Andrea, thank you for everything you do as a leader and as a champion of positive change agents too.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, David. And I hope you'll come back again and we'll continue this conversation.
Certainly, happy to.
What David showed us today is that the systems we've built, whether government, corporations, or global alliances, were never designed for this level of complexity that we're now facing. And when those systems fall short, people don't just lose services, they lose trust, meaning, and a sense of belonging. Here are the takeaways that I got from today's episode. First, technology isn't the biggest problem. It's how unprepared we are to deal with the change that it brings. If we don't help people navigate that change, we shouldn't be surprised when fear or even rage takes over. Second, trust is shifting. People are turning away from big systems and toward what feels local, human, and real. And maybe that's not a breakdown. Perhaps it's a clue for how we move forward. And third, leadership today isn't about having answers. It's about helping people feel safe enough to imagine new ones. Because when we use our imagination as infrastructure, we're giving ourselves the scaffolding to build a different future. What David taught us today is that the future of governance isn't about institutions, it is about imagination. How we choose to govern ourselves now, individually, locally, and globally will define what's possible for the next generation of systems, leaders, and communities. And this is at the heart of sense-making conversations. This podcast exists to explore complexity with clarity, so we can learn how to respond, how to lead, and how to create from a place of deep humanity, even when the world doesn't seem to make sense. If this conversation challenged or inspired you, share it with someone else who's navigating change. And subscribe to Sense-Making Conversations, because these are the voices that are helping us to shape what's next. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this has been Sense-Making Conversations. Until next time.